All right, good afternoon, everyone. Me again, Hei Wai Tang, the director of the Asia Global Institute. Today's talk needs no introduction, no motivation, but I have to go through the formality to introduce our distinguished speaker today. And there are several highlights of his career that I want to discuss with you. Our speaker today is Martin Wolf, who I have met recently in India. And we shared the same stage, and we share a lot of comments about the global economy and what's going on in the US. So it didn't take too much of our time to become friends and collaborators in global discussions and events about the global economy. He's a chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. He was awarded the Commander of the British Empire in 2000, a member of the UK Government Independent Commission of Banking between 2010 and 11, honorary fellow of Nuffield College at Oxford University, as well as King's College in London. He has won many awards for his contribution to financial journalism as well as economic writing. He has written many best-selling books. One of my favorites is actually The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which he has already expressed concerns about the potential return of Trump, as well as the emergence of authoritarianism in Western democracies. Today's talk is about Trump, and the title is How Donald Trump's Second Coming is Transforming the World. I guess it needs no motivation, and I don't need to convince you why we all should understand it better and try to navigate the complex geopolitical system and landscape together with Martin. So in one of the most recent FT articles he wrote, titled The World Economy in an Age of Disorder, which just came out 2 days ago, and then he said, quite apart from some evident macroeconomic uncertainties, disturbing trends in fiscal deficits and debt in many important countries, we are witnessing two huge events. The first one, obviously, is the abdication of the US as a global hegemon, and the other one is an uncontrolled onset on what could be proved to be the most important of all humanity's technological innovations, namely artificial intelligence. No wonder we are confused. The remarkable thing, however, is how well the world economy has coped with the shocks and the uncertainty, at least so far. That's exactly what you wrote in the FT article 2 days ago. So in the next hour and a half, Martin is going to help us to clear up some confusion and help us navigate the complex and ever-changing geopolitical landscape. There will be Q&A. Martin said he's going to speak for 40 minutes. I guess we should give him more time. Over lunch just now, we had gained a lot of wisdom. Every time I talk to him and listen to him, I became wiser. Martin, the stage is yours.
Okay. So, I'm not as tall as that. So, first, it's a pleasure to be here. This is obviously a very large room. I hope everyone can hear and see reasonably well. Because of the setup here, I realize I'm going to have to refer to these charts here because I have to remember what I was supposed to be saying at this stage. And I will also pull out I never know whether I will need this, but it turns out I will definitely need this, so I can follow myself, as it were. So the subject of this presentation, speech, whatever, is how the world is changing and with some implications for what might happen next. I think the most important introductory remark I would make is this. I've been alive for nearly 80 years, and I have been an analyst of the world economy for 55. And I'm absolutely convinced we are now experiencing one of the most significant turning points, not just in our lives, but in world history. We have lived But I mean we very broadly. It's obviously not true for everybody at all times. But in the period since the end of the Second World War, we've lived in a world that America created and that American institutions created and American values. And it was filled with many, many errors and mistakes. But it is worth stressing, and I won't go into this versus, on every possible metric, this has been the most prosperous period in world history. And it is a resounding success in this and other ways. And one of the ironies, which I think I've got at one of the charts, is that America did particularly well during this period. It retained more or less its globally dominant position, despite the development of so much of the world, even of China. And of course, and in terms of relative real incomes, it remains far and away the richest large economy in the world. China is in that sense still vastly behind. Real GDP per head in China is probably at most a third of US levels. It has outstripped the other major developed countries in terms of standard of living, and yet the Americans are very, very miserable. And they have decided, therefore, to blow themselves and the world up. And I'm putting it rather starkly, but then I'm a journalist, and if people, Keynes once used to say, the essence of getting a point about is simplify and exaggerate, and that's what I've just done. But I was only simplifying a little and exaggerating a little. I don't believe this is temporary, though how it will evolve, we don't know. I think we should imagine we're moving into a different world where that hegemonic role in the institutions it created and the system it created is fundamentally changed. And I think one has to broaden one's mind to understand that this opens up a whole range of new possibilities, both bad and good, for the world in which we all live. That's very obviously true for somebody like me living in Europe with a European background, but I think it's also true in this region of the world. So that's the introduction I want to make, and I hope that sort of sets the ground. I'm going to cover the following major issues. First, I'm going to discuss his revolutionary project. Very, very briefly. If you want fuller detail, read my columns and those of many of my colleagues, and very, very good commentary on all this in many American journals, particularly, I think, The Atlantic. I'm going to talk then about what this means for the world economy. Since I'm an economist, I'm an economics commentator, I'll focus on that, and I think it's probably of particular interest here. Then I'm going to address the question, is this a temporary interruption in business, and will we return to business as usual? And I'm going to argue we're not going to return to business as usual, but it might be a temporary interruption. Both are possible. Very important. In fact, both are quite probable. The fourth thing I'm going to talk about, and one of these was mentioned in the introduction, was basically, this is the political environment talking about is not the only form of uncertainty we have. And I'm going to talk about this technological change, artificial intelligence, because I have some thoughts about it and I've written some things about it, which I quite like. And then I'm going to talk about how the world is going to respond or should respond to these transformations. And then there's a conclusion. Okay, the revolutionary project. First of all, Trump's second coming and second presidency is quite different from his first. And some people have been surprised by this, and even I've been surprised by how true this is. But I wrote a great many columns before it happened indicating how that might turn out to be true. And by and large, what he's been doing is in line with what I expected, with what anybody who followed closely expected. This time he has, and these are crucial things in understanding what he thinks about himself. He thinks he's a man of destiny, who survived his failed attempted coup. That was what it was. It was a failed attempted coup. And he survived politically and personally. He's also survived several assassination attempts. Though he believes quite clearly at a profound level, he's chosen by destiny to transform his country and the world. He has the benefits of an absolutely and astoundingly loyal party in Congress, which is essentially unprecedented in American history outside wartime. Parties in America don't behave in the way the Republican Party does. It shifted from being a standard American party to being, and I use this word advisedly, though it may be offensive to ones, to a Führerprinzip party. This is the way the Nazi Party ran as a system. Third, he has an administration this time completely different from last time, completely different when he was dependent on outsiders. He didn't know who to promote and appoint. He didn't have any idea how to do this. He now has an administration filled with devotees, if not to him personally, at least to the cause, the revolutionary cause. One of the most significant of them all is the head of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, who John Vought, who was at the Heritage Foundation and wrote the 2025 project, which is the project for transforming American government, undoing the administrative state. And he has, because of him, and others, but particularly because of him, a worked out program. So this is something completely new, and it is actually really unprecedented. The closest to this is FDR, a different revolutionary project, but that was really trial and error, pretty well throughout. This was much more coherent and worked out. And they have a worked out program and a will to remake the world. And I don't think that should be underestimated. At home, the administration seeks to dismantle the New Deal administrative state. And the simplest way to do that is to make sure it's completely dysfunctional. And they're doing a wonderful job at that. They're also getting rid of a lot of people who want to make it work. So that is fundamentally changing the way the government of the United States operates on a day-to-day basis, its capacities and effectiveness. And I made the suggestion in various talks I gave in Beijing in March when I was there for the China Development Forum, that one way of thinking about what they're doing is this is the American version of the Cultural Revolution. It's a very American version of the Cultural Revolution, but it has a lot of similarities. And I think sometimes I've sort of thought, well, yeah, maybe Trump is more like Mao than any other post-war leader. That's not entirely a joke. In fact, it's not a joke at all. Now, they intend to erode the rule of law and the division of power. Their essential idea is what's called the unitary executive theory. And the unitary executive theory is basically, to put it very crudely, you can go read the literature on it, that the president can do whatever he likes. And by the way, Mr. Trump has said on television, you can look at it up and said, I'm the president of the United States, I can do whatever I like. That's not the Constitution. It doesn't say that, believe it or not. So to do that, of course, that means the rule of law and the constitutional constraints have to be abolished, and they've done a pretty good job of that. Congress has disappeared. A very large number of his actions are, to put it mildly, questionably legal. We will see whether the Supreme Court stops much of it. I suspect it won't. But there's an even bigger thing going on here, in my view, which is a counter-enlightenment. Namely, the whole project of the US going back was an enlightenment to the Constitution, was an Enlightenment project. It was one of the most important products of the Enlightenment, actually. I won't go into the history of how they got it, who were the influences, but one of the most powerful ones was Montesquieu, who's one of the most important Enlightenment philosophers. So undermine the Enlightenment commitment to science, reason, and expertise, replacing these things with your emotional views. The way I feel about things. One of the most interesting things about what's going on in America is that the left and the right share completely this view that this Enlightenment project must be dispensed with. Since I'm a completely Enlightenment person, I recognize we have always had shared enemies on the left and the right, the moment the right is in power, and they're very similar. And many would argue, I think this is a bit more controversial, but I think it's true, replace all these with a patrimonial state. And one way of thinking about a patrimonial state is that the boss controls everything. It's a monarchy. It's a monarchy. And quite a few of the thinkers in America, if you can call them thinkers, like Curtis Yarvin, who's a protege of Peter Thiel, explicitly say what we want is a monarchy, which is why we're getting all the no kings demonstrations. And I wrote a column about the relationship between Trump's claims and those of Charles I, who you will remember the British English very sensibly executed. And in my view, weren't completely right to do. So this is pretty big stuff. And of course, it goes without saying that if all this happened, liberal democracy as we know it would disappear. But there's also, of course, a project. Oh, sorry, I'm doing stupid things. No? Oh, sorry. Now I've got it. Okay. Abroad, the administration seeks to abandon the US role as a stabilizing hegemon. They've been completely clear about that in both security and economics. Abandon the US commitment to the liberal world order. This is shown most clearly in the complete destruction of every rule and principle of the World Trade System, which is one of their more significant commitments, which really were rooted in the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of, I think, 1934, but middle of the 30s. Return to 19th century order of competing great powers and spheres of influence. Of course, people might feel that this old version of what they said they were trying to do was hypocritical. But hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. The fact that the US pretended to be, in many occasions, a decent moral global power, at least compelled it to behave in ways compatible with that self-image. And very often it did. It's not much noted, for instance, in the WTO. The US frequently lost cases, and it actually changed its laws as a result. This wasn't just a pretense. And a great power without such benevolent hypocrisy is always a predator. Okay. And I did have this chart. I think this is really a rather wonderful chart. It gives you some idea of the order, what the order achieved. So this is GDP per head in real terms. I won't go into the source at the moment. It's a very well-known source. For the US, Western Europe, the world as a whole, China and India, it just reveals something very important. There has been a spectacular rise in global average GDP over this period, this is a log scale, by the way, which has gone up 5 times. And the US has also gone up 3 times, even though it was far and away the richest place in the world, and it's still far and away the richest large place in the world today. And if you allow the log scale, it is on a GDP head basis, it's at 3 times bigger than China. So the US hates this order that it created, but it did pretty well in it, and everybody else did spectacularly. I think we have to remember how spectacular the success will be. So this is my second section. Better get going here. What do I think will be the other likely outcome of the economic side of the program? And I'm going to discuss these issues. A permanent increase in uncertainty, not a temporary increase, a permanent increase. Some deglobalization, I don't know how much, nobody does. Some de-dollarization, more likely than a full de-dollarization, in fact inconceivable. We will just get a global monetary disorder. We just discussed that over lunch, and I will talk about that when we get to that. Continued US external deficits. It's not going to cease to be a major international borrower, which is what Trump promised, because the macroeconomic policies of the US are completely inconsistent with that aim. And I should stress, I didn't that, one of the most pronounced features of this administration is its profound internal intellectual incoherence. Things that they say they want with one voice are absolutely in contradiction with things they're doing with another voice. So the trade protection is designed to eliminate the deficits, and the fiscal policy is clearly going to increase them. Just give a simple example. And I think it will generate lower growth globally. Everybody will be, to a greater extent, constrained by the consequences. But how far, that depends a bit on how other people behave. This has stopped. Let me. Okay, now I've got it. Okay, my fault. I'm focusing too much on what I'm thinking and not on this wonderful little machine. So the uncertainty generated by the onset of the trade war has reduced in recent months, but it has definitely not disappeared. And this is a chart from the latest World Economic Outlook from the IMF, published last week. I used it in my column last week. And uncertainty measures are all very subjective, and they're basically based on counting use of these words. So I don't want to exaggerate their meaning. But it is rather interesting that we had in the early period of this administration a few months ago an explosive rise in uncertainty measures, particularly in trade, and that's diminished as trade agreements have been reached, but it remains at a very high level compared to where it was before. And I think it will probably stabilize at this relatively high level. And the broader economic policy uncertainty is also at an elevated level, but it's the insane uncertainty of the April 2nd announcement and subsequent periods has more or less gone. Then growth, I think this is very interesting. One of the ways I don't think anyone can forecast growth, so I don't get very worked up about the growth forecast levels, but this is quite an interesting sign of what's happened to growth expectations. And I won't focus on the 2025 ones because we're coming to the end, but it's quite interesting looking at the forecast for 2026. And generally, though not for everybody, the view now in October of the IMF is more optimistic than it was in April. In other words, the worst shock associated with the April announcements has passed out of people's current expectations, and that fits in with the uncertainty picture. And that's relatively encouraging. In a sense, it means that people have adjusted to this. Now, these growth rates aren't very high, but they are very significantly positive, and that's a good thing. Now, I want to talk about globalization, because there's a lot of discussion of deglobalization and deglobalization. And I just want to stress, because I'm sure people here all understand that, but not everybody does, that globalization, broadly defined, is a very big concept. It's not just about trade. I'm going to talk trade in goods. I'm going to talk about that, most of it, and we inevitably talk about it in terms of the trade war, because tariffs affect trade in goods. They don't affect other things. But it's important to remember, in addition to goods, there's trade in services, and trade in services is itself divided completely into trade in services that involve movement of people and trade in services that is disembodied. And trade in services that is disembodied remains very, very dynamic. And it's basically about the technological opportunities of transmitting data. I'll come to that further online. And it's overwhelmingly probable that it will continue to grow relative to other forms of trade, and this is not going to stop it. Certainly what they're doing so far, it's not going to stop it at all. The third is movement of capital. I don't have time to go into that. Cross-border capital flows and stocks. Stocks have continued to rise, but flows diminished after the financial crisis. They've not reverted to where they were before. So in that sense, globalization diminished. But there's nothing happening here so far in the Trump program, which is going to affect flows of capital dramatically. In some ways, it's going to encourage more. It's clearly trying to encourage a lot of tariff jumping investment by foreign businesses inside the United States. So the location of capital will change, but capital flows will continue. The fourth is really interesting and important and not discussed enough in the economic sphere, which is the movement of people. And it's clear that a very big force now in the world is attempts to stop or at least slow that. That's what Trump is about. It's happening in Europe, but it's separate from the other things. And the globalization of people moving around was a very big part of the world we've just lived through. And it was a very big part, by the way, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The fifth part is data. And with the exception of the Chinese state, which really does seem to do a remarkable job of controlling flows of data, no other government does, and no other government is trying. And that's a very big deal. It integrates a lot of activity across the world. And this won't be affected by what Trump is doing. And the final, and I think biggest one of all, is globalization of ideas. And in the world we now live in, that's sort of difficult to stop. Though again, the Chinese government is obviously trying harder than anybody else to stop it. Their policies on managing the flow of data are very similar to Mr. Trump's policies on managing the flow of goods, and equally destructive. But in the end, I think ideas will continue to flow across borders. The main point I'm making is ultimately none of us are going to isolate ourselves from the world. That's completely impossible, and it can be shifted the way we do it. This would seem to be banal, but I think it's important to remember. Tariffs only affect goods. Globalization will not be killed in any way, but trade in goods might decline significantly, and that depends a lot on how others follow and respond to what the US has done. Okay. Now, now I'm focusing on goods. It's a chart I've used quite frequently, and I think it's a very useful and interesting chart. And anyway, it's one of my favorites, and it shows the development of the world trade in goods relative to world output going back to 1820, actually 1825, I think, which is a long time. The data, of course, heroic, but I won't go into all that. The data on goods trade is actually relatively good. GDP is, of course, measured and estimated ex post. The crucial point is basically there have been two periods of globalization in the world history. That is, periods when trade in goods grew much faster than world GDP. The first was the second half of the 19th century in the imperial order, ending in the First World War. And then after the First World War, the Great Crash, and the Second World War, in the world, roughly speaking, world trade halved relative to world GDP over those deglobalization periods. Then from the low point of the World War II, there were two enormous rises. The first was the integration of the West, above all Europe and Japan, and later South Korea, into the world economy that the US had been opening. And the second was after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, bringing us to an absolute all-time peak just before the financial crisis of about 27% of world output, which was, roughly speaking, twice as high as it was in the previous peak. It has now fallen, not significantly, to a little over 20%. But the key point is this remains close to the most open and integrated world economy in goods ever, and it has a long, long way to fall. And so one of the really big questions, and that would certainly be very disruptive for our economies, and a big question is how far the US policies will do that. Remember, the US itself is responsible for, as an importer, very much less than a fifth of world imports. So it can't kill this on its own. It depends a lot on what others do in response. And I'm not going to go in through all of this because it's a great fun chart which I've taken from the FT website. You can look it up, our Trump tracker, but it gives some idea of the significance of the tariff moves we have seen so far. And I will stress 3 points. First, the little rectangle on the left shows the effective rates since 1900 of the US, and you can see that on the very latest estimate, we are pretty close to where it was just about the late 1930s. So there has been a very long liberalization, which was reversed very suddenly, and there's been lots and lots of change. And currently, for the Americans, the average effective tariff is roughly 5 times what it used to be. That's in terms of the shift of trade policy overnight, this is basically the biggest move that has ever happened. I can go through it before, but it's much bigger in terms of its proportional and change than the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which everybody writes about in the 1930s. And that's very significant. It's a very big barrier. The second chart that is worth is just to show how chaotic this has been. The blue line shows the tariffs that have been announced at various stages and what they meant in terms of levels, and what the basic point I wanted to bring out of that, and that is in this chart, is just how much change there's been, how unstable it's been. And the final, and this might continue, and the final is the effective tariffs actually paid have not yet got through. So we don't know where that will settle, but probably it will be a little bit less than 20%, as I've already indicated. So let me just move on. This is another way of looking at the agreed tariffs, and it's a very important way. These are the negotiated agreed tariffs with a large slew of important and interesting countries. And there are 2 points to notice about this, which are in some sense the same thing. First of all, and it's really important, these are wildly discriminatory. And for those who are wonks on WTO GATT, the most important principle, the first principle of the WTO, is that there should be non-discrimination. And the reason for that was, one, partly to avoid ganging up on weak countries and introducing bilateral considerations which have nothing to do with trade. The most favored nation principle was fundamental. And this violates this on a staggering scale. And this is a tariff schedule which has no precedent for any major country that I am aware of. And the second point I would make, there's actually 3. The second point is some of these tariffs are both incomprehensible and insane. So nobody imagined when this started up that he would end up with 50% on India. It was seen as one of the most important strategic relationships, a good relationship, and one that America wanted to encourage. And they ended up with a 50% tariff on India. For reasons I won't explain now, being put forward, which I think are crazy and insanely hypocritical. And it's, from a geostrategic point of view, probably the single stupidest policy action of the Trump administration, because basically they've driven India into the arms of China. What is that about? The second one is Brazil, and they've been quite explicit. The reason they have imposed these tariff on Brazil, another really important country, incomparably the most important in South America, and the neighbor, is that they decided to put the president who tried to overthrow their election in prison. And it's pretty clear that Trump regards that as a precedent that must be stopped. Then I'd like to put in Laos. God help us, what on earth decided them to put a tariff on? Because it has a large bilateral surplus, apparently. And Laos, I pointed out in various pieces, 2 or 3 pieces, was the country that America bombed to smithereens in the 1960s in the Vietnam War. And then, of course, at the other end, there are countries which have very small tariffs. Now, the discrimination means there's going to be a tremendous amount of trade diversion. And the trade diversion is going to be very complicated because people are going to try and launder their exports of components through countries with very low tariffs. So they're going to do whack-a-mole to stop trade diversion in very different forms as a result of this. It's going to make a complete mess of the trading system, and every time they notice this, they're probably going to change a tariff somewhere and make businesses' life even more difficult. The administrative complexity of this is terrifying. And finally, these tariffs have all changed quite recently, and they could change again. This is a stupefying way to do trade policy. I mean, there is no precedent for this in trade policy. And I thought, this is a subject I've been working on for much of my life. Now, in terms of I'm not going to focus on other things, I'll just focus on, it is, of course, important to stress why the US is in such a powerful negotiating position when it's involved in these negotiations. How did he get those things to happen without any retaliation except from China? That's crucial. They got away. And the reason is, these shows the share, it's very crude but simple, the blue bar shows the share of the exports to the United States of the country as a percentage of the exporting country's GDP. So it shows that Mexico and Canada's gross exports relative to GDP are colossal, as we knew. And the light blue shows the exports from the US to the country as a share of its GDP. And the basic point is very simple. Everyone is much more dependent on the US than the US is dependent on anyone. So in a bilateral, even China, that's even true for China, or definitely true for China. Don't forget, again, we're focusing on goods. And the result is that in any bilateral negotiation, it can kill the opposition, and it has. And it's not interesting enough fully with Canada. Canada didn't agree to become the 51st state. Surprise, surprise. I think it's the final thing on this theme. There were a lot of side deals in these deals, quote unquote, and they essentially involve very large investment pledges by countries. The UAE dramatically, Saudi Arabia, EU, Japan, South Korea, and Qatar. It's quite a lot of money. Will this happen? Very questionable. But there isn't a commitment by these countries to supply investment, most of which would have to come, in the case of the countries, from private businesses. How is that going to happen? The EU doesn't have the ability, Japan might. The EU doesn't order private businesses to do what they've agreed to. What these deals mean, are they operational? Nobody knows. So I'm going to move into, well, I'm going to be a little over in time, but I'm doing not so hopelessly, the de-dollarization issue. I think a degree of de-dollarization is inevitable because of falling trust in the US. Basically, the question being, will the US stand by its commitments? And given what it's just done to the trading commitments, the question is obviously pretty clear. And there are a number of other areas. There is a sense that the US has abused its financial power, particularly through its sanctions regime, and that has already irritated a lot of countries, including its allies, a great deal. And then, of course, there's the key point, which I won't, I think, explore in detail here. The US is becoming massively more indebted, internally and externally, principally as a byproduct of its long-running fiscal deficits. And most people who hold dollars hold, of course, dollar liabilities, and those dollar liabilities are usually interest-paying liabilities. And if the country is hugely indebted, one starts wondering about, is there going to be major inflation? And that's obviously a risk. And all these together will erode inevitably, I think, the role of the dollar. But I don't think there will be replacement of the dollar. The likelihood, rather, is for the future monetary system, is fragmentation with growing use of the euro and yuan renminbi alongside the dollar, and a somewhat greater role for cryptocurrencies, particularly stable coins. In other words, it's not that the dollar will be replaced, it is rather that there is no replacement, so we will have a messier monetary order. But I remain with the view that fiat currencies will remain dominant via stable coins and central bank digital currencies, if as part of it, much more likely than Bitcoin or anything like that, which is monetarily and financially irrelevant. Now, it's really inconceivable that the dollar will be replaced because it is just so dominant. And this is just of view of trade finance, admittedly based on SWIFT. So this omits quite a bit of what's going on in the Chinese system. But the dollar is an overwhelmingly dominant currency in trade finance and in payments more broadly. It's going to be very difficult to get away from the impact of the network effects associated with this. As a reserve currency, actually, the US has been on a very slow erosion over the last 25 years. That's the blue column, but it remains pretty overwhelmingly dominant. And importantly, as reserve currencies, almost all the other currencies that matter are those of its allies, or at least its historic allies. Whether they're still allies is a question, and particularly the Europeans. So the Western Alliance continues to be the overwhelming supplier of reserve assets. The Chinese renminbi is very, very small. And again, that might erode. It's very difficult to imagine anything but a cataclysm that would change that dominance overnight, or even over 10 or 15 years. The US is, of course, far and away the largest beneficiary of international finance, in the sense that it has been able to borrow. The global international investment position, it's the beneficiary of debt and equity financing of the US on a spectacular scale. It's allowed the US to spend more than its income for the last 25 years in a very big way. And the US has every intention of continuing to spend more than its income, as we can see from its fiscal policy. It guarantees this more or less. So the US is trying to stop that with a trade policy instrument, which, as I've already mentioned, won't work. But in some very obvious sense, the US is the largest beneficiary of the globalization of finance, which is very strange and not what one expected about 40 or 50 years ago. Oh yes, I did have this chart. This shows the public debt position, which is I think the biggest Achilles heel of the US. And you can see it is really rather remarkable that on current forecasts, in a relatively short time, US public debt held by the public, which includes foreigners, as a ratio of US GDP, will be above the levels reached at the end of the Second World War. That's an absolutely astounding piece of information, and rather disturbing. By the way, Another crucial element in this worry about the stability of US debt is real interest rates have exploded upwards over the last 4 or 5 years. They've gone from -1 to +2. That's a 3 percentage point shift. And with real interest rates at 2%, inflation at 2 or 3%, nominal interest rates are going to hang between 4 and 5, and that makes the management of public debt in an economy whose nominal GDP is probably growing at 4 quite difficult. And the final thing, I think it's the final thing, is it's pretty clear that the rising share of gold in reserves, which is essentially an expression of the result of the rise in price of gold, is a pretty clear indication. Flight to gold generally indicates a pretty clear loss of trust in fiat currency, and the most important fiat currency by far is the dollar, and I think that's what the gold price is telling us. And that again underlies the fragility in the monetary order without telling us precisely how it's going to move. So that lets me, I'm getting towards the end of this, to the sort of big questions this leaves us. What is the revolution, permanent or temporary? Trumpism, as I've called it, is the world's leading example of a broader phenomenon, populist authoritarianism in democracies. The underlying phenomenon was already identified in Plato's Republic, which is, so it's not a new phenomenon, written about 375 BC. It is driven by a blend of insecurity and grievance in the middle and lower middle classes, directed simultaneously up and down the social and economic scale. In this US, this insecurity is driven by a blend of deindustrialization, rising inequality, racism, and fear of a rising superpower rival. A whole set of worries and fears that have generated this rather a remarkable phenomenon. All this, I think, is likely to mean that Trumpism is going to endure even if Trump will not. The underlying sources of this rise in this form of politics are very unlikely to disappear, and they could easily get worse, particularly if I'm right about the prospects for inflation and destabilization of the fiscal system. Moreover, even if Trump and Trumpist autocracy disappears, awareness of the fragility of the liberal order cannot soon be forgotten. A system we were quite used to is sort of dissolved in a few months, and what has been seen cannot be unseen, and what has been experienced cannot be unexperienced. So even if Trumpism itself proves temporary, politics removes it, the memory is going to linger and affect the way people think. It can only fade away over what is likely to be a long time. The result is likely then to be a less integrated and less dynamic world economy into the future, offset perhaps by the impact of AI. Sorry. So the Trump revolution is far from the only source of change in the world system. Also important are superpower rivalries, which is obvious, technological changes, ongoing climate change, and in some, the world is moving, for all these reasons, into something of a new era. I'd just like to put this chart up. I think I've got two charts on AI because it's a really interesting issue. And this is really startling. This is chart we've been producing. I'm sure others have looked at this too, and perhaps some of you in the room. This breaks down the S&P 500 since 2022, the end of 2022, into what happened to the Magnificent Seven, what happened to the S&P 500 as a whole, and what happened to the S&P 493. And the basic point is it's all about this Magnificent Seven. The stock market moves we've seen are essentially a reflection of a bet on AI, investor bet on AI. And I'm not at all sure that what we are seeing so far is a viable business model for AI. There's obviously a viable technology. So that is a form of fragility. How big could the economic effect of AI be? I quite like this chart. It's a heroic guess by Goldman Sachs. It could well be right, but basically they went through every job category in the labor market statistics in the US and sort of made an estimate of how disrupted could this business, this activity be. And they concluded about 40% of the economy is unaffected. But from then on up, it goes up to quite large chunks where it's doesn't really matter anymore, where it could be very much affected. The basic conclusion from this analysis is there's a reasonable chance that a lot of jobs in the US economy, and this would apply certainly to other developed countries, will be changed profoundly or affected or disappear as a result of the AI revolution. And its impact on society could be very large because the people who will be affected are the middle and upper middle classes, which is not normally the class of the society which is affected by these sorts of change. And finally, I should just throw in the fact that though Trump has decided this doesn't mean anything whatsoever, there's absolutely no doubt that global climate is continuing to change and global heating will continue, and that will lead to some pretty big changes in our environment and ways of life. I'm not going to say how catastrophic they are, but they're certainly likely to be. Now, I've just got 2 slides left, I think, or maybe 3. There are what's happened in the US raises 2 big questions: how to respond to the US itself and how to deal with one another. The answer to the first has, with the crucial exception of China, been not to retaliate. China has retaliated and continues to do so using tariffs and export controls on rare earths and critical minerals. The US thinks this is completely unfair because only it is allowed to bully other countries. But it's right, it was allowed to bully every other country, just not China. And that was obviously going to happen. That was predictable. The answer to the second is so far to continue as before. What is interesting about the rest of the world is essentially it hasn't done anything except reach deals with the US, which it may or may not deliver upon. But there has been no proactive response. Countries are too dependent on the US to dare to cooperate against it. They act as vassals. But they also haven't made any attempt to improve trading relations with one another. The WTO continues to operate among other countries. I am frightened that in the next stage, because of the diversion process I've discussed, we're going to see the spread of protection across other parts of the world, and it will start with Europe against China. That, I think, is almost inevitable because trade from exports from China will be diverted from the US market to the European market, and the Europeans will not take it. And that's the next shoe that is going to fall. Conclusion. The US has effectively become a revolutionary power. This will create a great deal of instability, which is likely to be enduring. It's not just going to disappear. The US is also a profligate power in a world economy that encourages this profligacy. It's the biggest borrower in the system because everybody wants to lend to it. But the US is intellectually incoherent at the moment and hates the inevitable outcome of its own profligacy, which is sustained trade and current account imbalances, which is sustained trade and current account imbalances. So it's fighting a war in its current policy settings in international affairs, which is ultimately against itself. And you can't win a war against yourself. And of course, the US is also destroying its own alliances. And I haven't had the time to discuss that, but it's a whole other dimension. How will this all end? Badly. So I've given you my overview, it took longer than I hoped. I apologize profusely of what is going on and what it might mean for the world economic system. And that's only a very small part of what's going on at the moment. And thank you for listening. And I apologize for going on too long. Bye. Okay.
Q&A, but
Yes.
have to wait
Oh, of
for the
course.
stuff to
Should I wait here or?
Wait
Oh, we're
for
going to sit
the
there.
chairs and get to see a little bit. And thank you so much.
We've got half an hour.
All right, Martin, that is a fantastic and super comprehensive presentation. Each PPT can easily provoke 2 or 3 questions. So I have 100 questions, but I'm going to let the audience to ask theirs. But before that, I'm going to ask maybe a couple. So first of all, we are still living in my opinion, close to a unipolar world. I understand that U.S. is not as strong and as powerful in terms of its economic contribution to the global economy, but in the Western world, the U.S. is the only country, in my opinion, somehow magically maintain a very high and consistent share of global GDP, around 26, 27% for a long time. And you did mention that a lot of countries are still heavily reliant on the U.S. as a final goods market, right? China included. So despite all the political polarization, or you may think, social tension within the U.S., I think we still have to live with a powerful but disturbing U.S. for a long time. I mean, it's not like, as you said, Trumpism will last, and therefore this global economic power will decline, and at some point, all the alliances and all the other countries can work more closely with each other to at least protect against the attacks or sanctions from the U.S. Would that be your final conclusion from your presentation?
I think it would be largely my conclusion as things stand. Well, I couldn't go through all this, but the US has a completely unique set of assets and combination. And that's why it was so powerful and so influential. And that's why the change in policy in the US is so important, because it's unique. I mean, the US is actually the first truly global power. There's only one potential rival, and that's China. And I don't want to go into this in detail, but it's obvious that China doesn't want to be, I think doesn't know how to be, a replacement for the US. And it talks about a new order, but it did pretty well out of the old order and would like it to have continued. I mean, after all, China's rise was actually promoted and helped by the US. So that's all true. But it's precisely because of America's power and unique attributes that its impact on the rest of the world is likely to be so large, because there's not much they can do about it. I would make, however, two qualifications to your remarks. The figures on share of GDP are figures of phenomenal GDP, and I regard they're very unrepresentative because they depend on exchange rate movements. And exchange rate movements of the US dollar have been peculiar, and I don't think they're likely to last. In real terms, there has been a decline, but it's unquestionably true. And if we look at PPP, it's not the world's biggest economy, and I think that is relevant. You couldn't look at the obvious staggering rise in China's military power without recognizing how large an economy it is. But it is absolutely true that the US remains the single economy with the largest array of assets of all kinds. But those did include its influence, its value as a model, what my friend Joe Nye would call soft power. And that is being, I think, eroded really significantly. My final comment on this is just to focus on trade. Most of world trade, it depends on how you measure, is not with the US. Because though it's a very large economy, it's a relatively closed one. And as a trading power, Europe is comparable. Some dimensions bigger, it's a bigger exporter. And of course, if you look at Asia as a whole, it's colossal. So it is perfectly possible for the rest of the world to maintain dynamic trade if it wants to do so, because it is, on any measure, 3/4 of the world economy. I think on a better measure, it's over 80% of the world economy. The rest of the world consists of countries basically that recognize their trading powers and they need to trade with one another. Surely true of ASEAN, it's true, I think, of China, certainly true of Europe. And I think it's in their interest to do so. So even if they don't retaliate against the US, they can make decisions about how to contain the spread of protectionism among them and to maintain as much openness as they can. I won't talk about the currency thing, which is more complicated. And so they can avoid having a war in any form, but certainly in trade with the US, while still having a considerable degree of agency in how they manage the trade with one another. And the least thing they can do is say, and I think they are by and large saying, we will continue to adhere to the WTO rules in all dimensions, as it affects our trade with one another. That really raises one big set of questions, which is about relations with China. I'm going to leave that aside for the moment.
Okay, I'm pretty sure that there will be a question about China later. So I'm not going to ask the China question. I'm going to ask the Indian question, because we met in India. We shared a lot of notes. Surprisingly, we also had a lot of similar opinions about what's going on in the global system. And I remember in India, in your presentation, you had a very provocative slide. In fact, it's actually slide 1. And you said, if goods don't cross border, soldiers will cross border. So in this sort of deglobalizing world that you describe, and again, I have a more nuanced view about deglobalization than yours. Do you think that, if countries become less connected through trade linkages with each other, the possibility of war is going to increase? I mean, it seems that one of the wars is going to be completed or finished in a very nasty way, but another war is still going on, or are you expecting that another war is going to emerge due to, what you said in India, which you maybe strategically chose not to mention here?
Well, the quote is from Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State under FDR and was essentially he was an American free trader. And I won't go into that. And he started off the impulse of the administration, which was then developed through the Truman administration towards creating what became the GATT. It was supposed to be the International Trade Organization, ultimately World Trade Organization. And I was just trying to make the point that for him and many of the Americans who were involved in the creation of this system, this was a peace project. It was as important as an economic. They didn't think this would greatly benefit the US. If they were producing, as they were, roughly half of world output, almost half of world output, the trade with the rest of the world was rather unimportant. But they did think that it would contribute to world peace, and particularly that it would strengthen relations among the democratic nations in the Cold War. So there was a broader political economic project. Now, you then ask the question, I think it's a very interesting question, whether maintaining close and vigorous trade relations among countries that are now open to trade with another would reduce the temptation to conflict. And the honest answer, I've never been sure about this. I believe more, or I have historically believed more in the democratic peace than the peace enforced by commercial ties. But you started with India, and obviously, one of the really big questions here is the future of India-China relations, and trade relations are going to be part of that. The Indians and Chinese have fought, though not in major wars, heavens. The United States is bringing them two together, which may be a good byproduct of this. But I do think that one of the ways to build good relations between them is to have a commercial relationship which both find rewarding. And that, in this case, China-India, is very, very hard. And it's a good thing if they focus on how to do that. And the biggest changes would probably have to be in China.
So why do you think it is hard? I mean, I was just in India last week, and this happened after the 50% tariff imposed by Trump. And I think the eagerness to re-engage with China and to look east has further increased since we last met. But it also expressed the concerns that the Indian firms are very afraid of the Chinese companies coming in to steal all the jobs and outcompete them. I think this is sort of implicit to Indians' DNA that they are so afraid of foreign competition and they always want to protect themselves.
Well, it's sometimes called the East India Company psychosis. And I couldn't possibly comment. There's no doubt that the Indians and many other countries are very concerned about China's competitiveness, and which is clearly the product of one, very major achievements of the Chinese economy, but also of quite a bit of state assistance. I think that one of the big residual issues, which I haven't been writing about recently, but it's going to be an enormous one in the future, is the consequences of what is widely seen, and in my view, at least in part correctly, as the predatory mercantilism of China. And I discussed it in my first column back after the summer holiday, in which I wrote under the very provocative headline, probably the most provocative headline I've ever written in 30 years of being a columnist at the FT, which is "The world is stuck." That wasn't stuck, but the world is between two predatory superpowers, and well, that's how many people view China.
Let me ask the last question before I turn the Q&A to the audience. So the U.S., you seem to be even more pessimistic about the U.S. than me. I lived there for 20 years, and a few years ago, I decided to come back to Hong Kong because I did experience, 2.5 years of Trump, and I realized that U.S. has decided to move in a very different direction than the U.S. that I enjoy a lot for many years. So we always believe that the U.S. democratic system is more resilient. I mean, you have a bipartisan arrangement, and you have election cycles. So don't you think at some point the pendulum is going to swing to another direction? Maybe you think that kind of swing is even worse because the leftists in the U.S. are no kidding, right? I mean, they define 13 different genders and allow different kind of marriage arrangements. So there's no possibility of things going back a little bit to the middle and ensure that the U.S. democracy is going to be sustained for a long time.
I didn't say there was no possibility. I said that even if that happened, we wouldn't go back to the status quo ante. The country's changed. I mean, to take one obvious example, I could have gone with it. In many dimensions, I'm not saying this would happen now, the Biden administration continued Trump's tariff and trade policies. They have achieved a certain bipartisan status. The attitude surprisingly, in my view, Trump is one of the least hawkish people on China in American politics on either side. So there are things that have happened which won't change. I suspect the protectionism, the nationalism, the concern about American industrial jobs, the attitude to China is sort of permanent. That's the first point. The second point, and that's what most important thing I was saying, don't think it'll go back to where it was 20 years ago. I don't think that horse has left the stable, I think, at least for my lifetime, which might not be very long. The second point is, and it's really important, I've read quite a lot on this, and I've lived in the States for 10 years. I went through Watergate, very interesting experience because so contrasting with what has happened in this case. I mean, there's no doubt at all, in my view, I'm going to be very brutal about this, that if the insurrection of Jan 6th had occurred in the Watergate era, the president would have ended in prison, the ex-president, because it was an insurrection. And that's basically what was going to happen to Nixon. He was going to be convicted. And this was bipartisan his Watergate was relatively trivial. So I think there has been a profound erosion of commitment to absolutely core constitutional and legal norms. which affect also profoundly the acceptance of the legitimacy of independent, powerful private institutions, of which the universities are most important. And those aren't just disagreements about policy, they're disagreements about absolutely core norms of any conceivable liberal democratic system, which is my last book, as you mentioned. And I think what has been happening and what is happening raises the question of whether a normal democratic order can be returned. And I've mentioned this, but I'm now going to get what to me seems to me the most profound breakage of norms. And there are two in particular. One is the very conscious, deliberate use of the law to prosecute critics, and including John Bolton. I know John Bolton really well. He's probably the most reactionary person I've ever known. And he's going to this. George Soros, a man of 96, who just gives money to causes he doesn't like. So that's the use of the law. And this is just beginning. This is showtile territory. And the second is that the President of the United States and the Defense Secretary, a completely unique event in the history of America, as far as I know, brought the entire high command of the armed forces together to inform them that a significant part of their future lay in using the might of the American forces against the enemy within, quote unquote, by which they meant protesters in American cities. This is police state stuff. This is not normal. This is not got a precedent. Now assume that actually happens, and the American military will be horrified. Well, they clearly were horrified by these words. Let's assume that in the next elections, the president declares there is a danger of insurrection in the following 15 major democratic cities. The vote will all be in person because he's already decided mail-in voting is intolerable. Whether that will go through, we don't know. And as a result of this, I'm going to put in substantial armed brigades, tanks, and so forth into every one of those cities. How many people do you think will vote? That's what he said. We're not talking about hypotheticals. You cannot but pretend that normal process is going on here. It isn't. Now, will this go ahead? Depends on the courts, depends on the Supreme Court. Broken reed in my view, but we'll see. But we are in territory that has no obvious precedent, as far as I know, except, I suppose, the period leading up to the Civil War. But in this case, well, this is unique. So it is certainly possible, and God, I pray that things will go back to where they were before. But the confidence that it will cannot be what it might have been, well, certainly 10 years ago. And it is pretty clear a program is underfoot, quite consciously, quite deliberately, to make it very, very, very difficult to get rid of him and to get rid of his party, because they don't regard, and this comes back to your comment, the other side as legitimate. They don't regard them as Americans. And in this case, democracy is over. So that's the least you can say. Of course, I wish I were wrong, but everything that has happened since I started writing about this, which is in March 2016, to be precise, indicates to me that one cannot underestimate the scale of the challenge to constitutional order in the US. Now, would the left be equally bad? Of course it is. Left-wing populists have Maduro is a left-wing populist, quote unquote. Of course they can be just as bad. The extremes have always been like this. What is different is that in America, somebody like that, Joe McCarthy was a very influential figure, very similar ideologically, but he was nowhere near the presidency. I mean, nowhere near, and ultimately he was squashed by the president. So this is different.
what a historical moment for the world. How about we open up to the floor? There's a gentleman on the left, and then Edward second.
Thank you so much. My name is Stefan Aura. I teach European Studies here at the University of Hong Kong. And I just want to comment or ask about two remarks you made, somewhat flippantly perhaps. In the introduction, you said that what's happening in the US is similar to the cultural revolution. I find this an odd place to make that comparison. Do you expect the extent of violence in the US to measure up to what happened during the cultural revolution? Because you just talked about the erosion of the rule of law state. Hong Kong prides itself on the rule of law, but you are aware of the fact that it has been severely eroded over the last couple of years. So that comparison I find odd to make in this city. The other question I have is, who destroyed the liberal international order? Is it not liberal hubris that destroyed liberal international order? You know, hyperglobalization against which this erratic revolution has been launched. And I mean, I certainly think of myself as a liberal. But the dream of that universal peace based on trade and order has been undermined not just by Trump, well before Trump. And one factor that I find also strange is an omission. You never once mentioned Russia. I mean, you know, peace through trade was to be achieved with Russia, and Europeans were at the forefront of it. That project failed, right? And Russia remains a very, very serious threat to peace and the international order that no longer exists. So would you like to comment also on Russia? But perhaps I'm more interested in that first question. Thank you.
So the first question, the reference is I was not trying to make the view, one, that it's that what's going on in the United States is the same as what went on in China under late Mao. What I was trying to say is it has this in common, which is that the leader of the state has decided to wage war against its own institutions and the people who implement it. So far, and that's a very important comparison, it's not a frequent event, and democracy is almost unheard of. How much violence will end up following from this depends on what now happens. And I can see anything between very little, or basically none, and colossal amounts. I don't want to go through the scenarios in which there will be colossal amounts of violence, but it's really not difficult to imagine. It really isn't. And what happens if there are regular protests involving millions and millions of people on the streets of American cities? What do you think Trump will do? Now, so that's the first thing. I didn't mention Russia because I didn't think it was relevant for the impact of Trump on the world economy, which is really my focus. And it links them to your second question. That's third, which is the liberal hubris. So I'm going to separate this into two elements. I wrote a lot about Russia, and I spent a lot of time visiting there in the 90s. My view is, and I couldn't discuss it at length, the Western world confronted an absolutely unprecedented and stupendously difficult problem of what to do with Russia after the fall of communism. And it messed it up comprehensively. My own view is that it was probably always highly likely it would, but the mistakes were many. I wouldn't now have the time, and nobody had that patience if I went through all those mistakes. But the outcome that has happened in Russia was always one of the possibilities. And I don't think there were so many forms of hubris, but liberal hubris doesn't seem to me the central element of that. The central element was They didn't know what they wanted to do, and we didn't either, because there was no precedent for this. It wasn't the same situation. For example, as in Germany after the Second World War, we didn't know what to do, and it was comprehensively messed up. So we've ended up with, in my view, a rabid power, which is a big problem. On the broader point, hyperglobalization and so forth, my view, and I said it in my book at length, you can read it and discuss it, is that the core problem was not, and it's very clear in my own book on globalization, there are lots of countries with much more trade than the United States, much more affected by trade than the United States, which have managed the adjustments relatively well in such a way that the commitment to trade has survived. We can think of countries in Europe, for example. Are you originally from Germany? I don't know. Slovakia. I apologize. I profoundly. The transformation of economies in the last 40 years has been very, very profound. But what's happened in the US is rather extreme, and that is despite the fact that relative to its economy, the changes induced by deindustrialization were really quite trivial, because it's a closed economy. And so the real question you have to ask is what really caused the problems, and what really caused the problems that the American elites decided essentially to take all the safety nets apart, in my view, and promote massive increases in inequality, quite unique, including through the tax system, which guaranteed there will be no cushion for any of the people adversely affected. And that's a policy, domestic policy choice. It's not the result of trade per se. So no, I don't accept that it's my fault, as it were, that we've ended up here. But of course, one has to recognize that lots and lots of mistakes were made, and Trump's didn't just happen by accident. That's obvious. And that my book is very much about the set of issues which led to his coming, and we can disagree about discuss that. But the key point I made, he has come, and he is changing the world, and I don't think it will be for the better, but that's another question.
I guess we can only take one more question from Mr. Chang over there.
Thank you, Mr. Martin, and thank you, Professor Tang. Because of your answer to Professor Tang's question, I feel it's urgent that I get your comments, your own personal view on Supreme Court, American Supreme Court. Do you think they will continue to be agreeable to Donald Trump's behavior? And if they do not, do you think they can provide a check and balance, counterbalance? Second, very short, you mentioned at the beginning of your speech that America shaped the value of the world, or at least of the North. Now, EU continuing be like the beam of light on their past value. Do you think that would continue? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll be very quick answers. On the Supreme Court, I am hopeful but not optimistic. I hope the distinction will be clear. We will see. There are a whole slew of very, very big cases coming before them now, and we will see what they decide. So far, their record, in my view, has been highly defective on some really, really important past cases whose fruit is now very, very visible, notably Citizens United and which allowed unlimited electoral expenses, essentially, and the voters' rights bill, which have allowed essentially limitless gerrymandering and other forms of voter suppression. So I'm not very optimistic, but one has to hope. On the EU, the EU will not, I think, be able to put together a coherent, unified, and powerful response to these challenges. It's not capable of it. It's too divided. And it's also too dependent on the US. But it is possible that the EU will remain committed to the principal planks of multilateralism, for example, simply because it is itself so dependent upon them. It is also so dependent on the rule of law as an institution that it is really hard for it to ignore its destruction internationally. This is quite problematic for it. So I don't expect the EU to in any way be a leader against this, but there's a reasonable chance that it won't make it worse. And that could be very important, actually, in this situation. At least I'm moderately optimistic on that. And by the way, in terms of its relationship, it does now have to find some way of providing its own security. It has the means to do so. It has the resources to do that. Will it do so? That's another huge question.
Thank you so much, Martin, for stopping by to share with us your most updated views about the global economy. I guess there are two takeaways on my side. One is it's very hard to be optimistic about the U.S. In terms of its geopolitical change or its relationship with the rest of the world. But on the relatively more positive side, there are many other countries outside the U.S. that have been improving, they have been growing, and they are still playing with the WTO rules. So let's hope that the multilateral trade system can still be rebuilt. In the meantime, without the US, but hopefully the US will change their mind and join the global force again. Thank you, Martin. Let's give a big round of applause to Martin.